So I'm ready and I am thrilled to introduce the first speaker, Jeremy Evans. He's been using Ruby since 2004. He's a Ruby committer, OpenBSD Ruby parts maintainer, lead developer of SQL, Roda, and Rodauth. By the way, I like his Twitter account. It looks like a changelog with list of releases. By the way, he's head of a government department that works in Ruby for more than 14 years. Government department, can you imagine that in Ukraine, for example? I can't. For fun, he spends time with wife and kids, plays ice hockey and video games, maybe among attendees who have similar hobbies. So let's give a round of applause in chat for our special guest from Sacramento, California, Jeremy Evans. And by the way, I'm launching the poll about Rodauth, so you guys can start answering. 1 second. The second poll coming here. Launch poll. Jeremy, the floor is yours.
All right, hello everyone. It's my first time doing an online conference, so bear with me. I'm gonna try to get my screen sharing set up here. All right, so hopefully all of you can see that. Awesome, all right. So good afternoon or evening, I think in the Ukraine. That's actually my second time presenting to an audience in the Ukraine. Last time was in 2014. I was able to present in Kiev to RubyC, and that was a really great experience for me. Today I'll be talking about Rodauth, Ruby's most advanced authentication framework. So let's see. There we go. So again, my name is Jeremy Evans. I'm the author of Rodauth. As Anna mentioned, I'm also a Ruby committer, an OpenBSD committer, and the maintainer of the SQL database library and the Roda web toolkit, as well as many other gems. So when I'm not busy working on open source projects, I manage the IT operations for a small government department, including leading the programming team. And I say team, but it's really just me and one other programmer. So first, let me go over the agenda for this presentation. So I'll be talking about the history of Rodauth, highlight some differences between Rodauth and other Ruby authentication frameworks, discuss Rodauth's goals, and get into some code examples so you can get a good idea of how Rodauth is configured and how to use it. Now first, a brief history of Rodauth. Now Rodauth was created in 2015, and at the time I had over 10 separate applications I maintained that all had ad hoc approaches to authentication. Authentication requirements differed significantly between the applications. Multiple applications used LDAP for authentication, while others stored password hashes in the database. All of the Ruby authentication frameworks at the time were specific to Rails, and none of my applications were Rails applications. So I got a crazy idea to write my own authentication framework, and it had to be flexible enough to handle the very different requirements of each application. So after review of the other authentication frameworks, I also wanted this framework to take a different and stronger approach to password hash storage security, since this more security approach was already in use in a few of my applications. So about Roda's tagline, Ruby's most advanced authentication framework. And that's a bold claim, considering there are older and more popular authentication frameworks, such as Devise, AuthLogic, Sorcery, and Clarence. Hopefully, by the end of this presentation, I'll have convinced you that Rodauth is Ruby's most advanced authentication framework. And if I do a good job, maybe you'll even want to consider using it in one of your future projects. So let me talk a little bit about features. I'll compare features between Devise and Rodauth. Clarence, AuthLogic, and Sorcery have features that are more or less a subset of Devise's features, so this analysis should also apply to them. Now, Rodauth handles pretty much all of Devise's features. Rodauth has features for login and logout, creating accounts, verifying email addresses for accounts, handling password resets, locking out accounts after a certain number of failed password attempts, remembering users using a cookie, logging authentication actions, expiring sessions, validating logons and passwords, and allowing users to close their accounts. Rodauth doesn't stop where Devise stops, though. It handles many other security-related features. It supports disabling the reuse of passwords, disabling common passwords, forcing a password or account expiration, forcing the use of only a single session, and allowing global logout of all sessions for a user. It ships with support for multiple multi-factor authentication methods. It supports WebAuthn security keys, as well as TOTP, the time-based one-time codes. You can also set up multi-factor authentication using SMS or generate account recovery codes in case a user loses access to their normal multi-factor authentication device. Rodauth ships for support for multiple passwordless authentication methods, allowing authentication using email links or using a WebAuthn security key instead of a password in order to log in. Rodauth includes a JSON API for all features it ships with, storing authentication information in JSON web tokens. That's right, every feature can be used both with standard HTML forms and also via a JSON API. The JSON API supports cross-origin resource sharing, as well as separate access and refresh tokens. Now, Rodauth has a lot of features, but I mean, can't you get the same features using third-party extensions to Devise? I mean, in some cases you can. There's a Devise extension to add a JSON API, a Devise extension to add TOTP support, and a Devise extension to add a WebAuthn support. But if you want to support like TOTP or WebAuthn support via a JSON API, you'll probably have to write such an extension yourself. The main benefit of having Rodauth include all these features is that you don't need to worry that a Rodauth upgrade will break one of the features that you are using, unlike when using a third-party Devise extension. So hopefully I've demonstrated that Rodauth ships with pretty much all the authentication features that your application could need. One thing that Rodauth doesn't ship with is support for OAuth, and that's because Rodauth is designed for cases where you are handling the authentication, whereas OAuth is designed for cases where you're letting a third party handle the authentication. Many of Rodauth's features, such as changing passwords or locking out an account, would make no sense when using OAuth. Now, you can certainly use both Rodauth and OAuth in the same application if you want to support both. The authentication flows are separate, and the two should not conflict. Now, if you do want to have OAuth support integrated into Rodauth, there is a Rodauth feature that ships in an external gem. It's currently named Rodauth, but it will be switching to Rodauth OAuth in the next release. So next, I'm going to talk about security. Now, Rodauth has a stronger security approach than other authentication frameworks, especially in regards to password hash storage. Now, the biggest problems with passwords is that people tend to choose poor passwords, and they tend to use the same password on multiple sites. And that means that any popular site that stores passwords is a target for hackers. Even if the site doesn't store anything else of value, if hackers can get access to the stored password hashes, they can try to crack the hashes, and then use the same email address and cracked password to access other higher value websites. Most of the other authentication frameworks that I mentioned store the password hash in a column in the user's table. And with a single SQL injection vulnerability in the application, the hackers can get access to the password hashes for all of the users, which they can try to then crack offline using dedicated password cracking machines. Rodauth uses a different approach by default. It stores the password hashes in a separate table and prevents the application from reading from that table. So to check for a valid password, Rodauth calls a database function to get the password hash salt for the account. It uses the salt and the provided password to compute a password hash. It then calls another database function to check if the computed password hash matches the stored password hash. The database functions have access to read the table, but direct access is not allowed. This uses a technique called security definer database functions. Rodauth uses this approach by default on PostgreSQL, MySQL, and Microsoft SQL Server. However, for compatibility, Rodauth can also function in cases where database functions cannot be used, or when the password hash is stored in a separate column in the same table. Unlike other authentication frameworks that use purely random tokens for things like password resets and account unlocks, Rodauth's tokens always include the account identifier in the token, and this prevents the ability to brute force all current tokens for all accounts at the same time. With Rodauth, you can only try to brute force the token for a single account, and the token is compared using a constant time string comparison. With other authentication frameworks, the token is looked up using a database index, which allows for a theoretical timing attack. Rodauth supports and recommends the use of HMACs for additional security for tokens, and this makes it so that even if an attacker is able to exploit an SQL injection vulnerability in the application and get access to all of the tokens will not be usable without the knowledge of a separate secret which isn't stored in the database. Now, Rodauth has 3 goals: security, simplicity, and flexibility. I've discussed security, so let me move on to simplicity. With most of the other authentication frameworks, configuring them requires changes in multiple separate places. You'll be configuring a model, a controller, views, and routes, all in separate places. Rodauth handles all authentication configuration in the same block. In your application, when you load Rodauth, you pass it a block, and this block is used to configure all of Rodauth's features. Note that all the features I discussed earlier are optional. With Rodauth, you explicitly enable every feature that you want to use. You enable Rodauth features by calling the enable method inside the block, and this loads the feature into the Rodauth configuration, including loading methods that are used to configure the feature. Maybe you were using a different table name for the table that are storing the password reset tokens, and also maybe you want to change the subject of the password reset email. After loading the reset password feature, you can call methods to override the default values for both settings. Rodauth ships with over 1,000 such configuration methods, allowing you to override virtually all parts of every supported feature. Now, Rodauth doesn't stop there. It allows you to override all parts of every supported feature in a request-specific manner. All of Rodauth's configuration methods except a block, and passing a block allows for request-specific behavior. Now, in this example, we assume that the accounts table has a column specifying whether the account is an admin. If the account is an admin account, we use a different email subject that includes the IP address of the password reset request, where it was received from, as the admin may find that useful. So let me state that again for emphasis. All of Rodauth's configuration methods support this feature, and so all configuration can be made request specific. This ability to choose exactly which features to enable and the ability to override any part of the framework in a request specific manner is how Rodauth achieves its 3rd goal of flexibility. Now, when I was going through the previous example, you may have noticed that we loaded Rodauth by calling the plugin method. So what's going on here? That's because Rodauth is implemented as a plugin for the Roda Web Toolkit. So far, I've only showed how Rodauth is configured. I haven't actually shown how to use it. So let's do that now. Roda is a web toolkit that uses the idea of routing requests using a tree made out of Ruby blocks. You can also think of it as a very fast and configurable web framework. When a request is received, the route block is called. The route block is yielded the request object, and the first line calls the Rodauth method on the request object. And this handles all of the routes that are added by Rodauth. The second line calls the require authentication method on the Rodauth object, which will redirect to the login page if the account has not been authenticated, or the session has not been authenticated. This ensures that the entire rest of the application is only reached for sessions that have already been authenticated. While Roda is the fastest Ruby web framework with any significant usage, it's still far less popular than Rails or Sinatra. So having Rodauth only usable in Roda applications would be a shame. Thankfully, Roda includes a middleware plugin, which allows the Roda application to be used as rack middleware by any other rack application, including Sinatra or Rails. So when using Rodauth as middleware, it's best to set the Rodauth instance in the rack environment so that the application using the Rodauth middleware will have access to the Rodauth instance. With Sinatra, the integration is almost as simple as this. For Rails, it used to be substantially more involved. But thankfully, Janko Moronik, the author of Shrine, recently released Rodauth Rails, which integrates Rodauth with Rails. So if you have a Rails application and you're considering authentication options, adding Rodauth is now about the same difficulty as adding one of the other authentication frameworks. In my biased opinion, it's probably worth it if you need features that are not provided in other frameworks, or you value the additional security or flexibility that Rodauth offers. Now, in the previous example, we required authentication for all actions. What if only some sections of your application require authentication? Maybe most of your application is open, but only the admin section needs to be authenticated. This is where Roda's routing tree shines. You can easily move that require authentication call from the top of the main route block to the top of the block used for the admin branch. Requests for other branches of the routing tree will not call this block, and therefore authentication will not be enforced for them. How about cases where you need multiple different types of authentication in the same application? Maybe you're issuing WebAuthn security keys to all admins and you want to enforce their use. But for regular users, they have the option of using WebAuthn or TOTP authentication if they choose to, but they're not required to set it up. So let's walk through how to set this up in Rodauth. Our Rodauth configuration for normal users stays mostly the same, except in this example, we are using the WebAuthn and OTP features. Here we have a separate configuration for admins that enables the WebAuthn feature, but not the OTP feature. We know this configuration is designed for admins because we've given it the name admin. And in our admin configuration, we use the prefix configuration method to tell Rodauth that the routes for the admin configuration will be served under the admin branch. And it's important that if we have multiple Rodauth configurations, that the Rodauth routes use different prefixes so that there are no routing conflicts. We'll also use a different session key in the admin configuration so that the session key is different from the default. And that way, logging in as a regular user will not provide access as an admin. In the admin branch of the routing tree, we first try the Rodauth routes for the admin configuration. We then require authentication for the routes. As we have loaded a multi-factor authentication feature, when require authentication is called, it actually does two checks. If the user is not logged in, it will redirect them to the login page. If the user has logged in via a password, but is not authenticated using a second factor, it redirects them to the multi-factor authentication page. So if you use a require authentication, you can be sure that you are enforcing multi-factor authentication if the user has it enabled. Right after that, we call require two-factor setup. If the user has not set up multi-factor authentication, this will redirect them to the page to set up their WebAuthn security key, and they will not be able to access the admin section until they have done so. For all the other sections of the app, other than the admin section, we have the same code I showed previously, which will redirect the user to the login page if they haven't logged in. If they have set up multi-factor authentication, but they haven't authenticated using a second factor, this will redirect them to the multi-factor authentication page, just as it did for admins. But unlike for admins, we're not forcing users to set up multi-factor authentication. Now, I hope I have convinced you that Rodauth is Ruby's most advanced authentication framework. It's even better if you will now consider using Rodauth for your authentication needs in your next application. If you want to play around with Rodauth, try the demo site. It's graciously hosted by Heroku. It's not much to look at, but it will give you a good idea for how Rodauth works from a user's perspective. If you'd like to learn more about Rodauth, visit the Rodauth website, which includes all of Rodauth's documentation, including documentation for every configuration method supported by Rodauth. If you'd like to get involved with Rodauth, you can view the source on GitHub and submit issue reports for any bugs you find, or pull requests to fix bugs or add new features. And that concludes my presentation. I'd like to thank you all very much for listening to me. And if you have any questions, hopefully I'll be able to answer them now. And any questions I can't answer now, hopefully I'll be able to answer in the chat.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Yeah, thank you. You aren't able to hear all the claps, but we are here. Yes, and we have questions. I'm passing the microphone to Bogdan.
Yeah. Hi, Jeremy. Thank you for such awesome talk. And
thank you.
We even have more time for the questions. So first and most popular question would be, how do you organize your personal time to support such a big, enormous amount of open source projects and repos? It's really amazing. And I just checked your last comment, for example, on the topic was 2 hours ago, you closed the ticket, right? So for us, it seems you never sleep and always ready to support the people.
Yeah, I mean, my company, the government department I work for, heavily uses SQL, Roda, Rodauth for all of our applications. So I basically have time at work where I can work on the applications if I need to. So a lot of the maintenance on the applications happens during normal business hours. There is quite a bit of it that also happens in personal time as well. So I'm probably checking, for new bugs or issues, pull requests, maybe every few hours, so I'm not sleeping. But it doesn't take that much time. I focus mostly on fixing bugs as a first thing, and then only adding features sort of as a secondary thing. But bug reports are get much higher priority for everything that I work on. So it honestly doesn't take as much time as people may think. Maybe that's just because it's not nearly as popular as some other options, which is a double-edged sword. But it doesn't take so much of my personal time.
Okay, thank you for answer to that question. And the next one would be, do you know about any examples how large a Rails application has switched to Rodauth from other libraries or solutions?
So let me make sure let me see if I can understand the question. Do you know any large Rails app that has switched to Rodauth? Yeah. Unfortunately, I do not know that. Rodauth Rails only came out, I believe I think it was last month. It hasn't been out very long. So I don't know any of that. I think Django might know. I know he is working personally. The reason he created Rodauth Rails is he's personally working on a quite large Rails application that will be using Rodauth for all of its authentication. So it was sort of designed around the needs of his app, but it doesn't just encompass what he's using. He's actually taken every feature that Rodauth offers and added basically full Rails support for it. So you can basically handle it like you would handle a more typical Rails, extension or engine or whatever it's called.
That sounds like a huge chunk of work. And the next question would be, has Rodauth handling of things ever changed and made it around for 180 degrees and moved into different direction as your own views evolved on solutions for some problems? And the next additional question would be, was that hard for you to do some breaking changes in Rodauth?
I definitely wouldn't say it hasn't been 180 degrees, but probably, 60 degrees maybe. Definitely there are certain features that have changed significantly. Most of the changes I think were before 1.0. So Rodauth was originally released in 2015. Version 1.0 was released in 2016, and version 2.0 was released, I believe, last month. There were a few breaking changes in Rodauth 2.0, but most of the changes were new features, such as WebAuthn support. Rodauth 1.0, I think the major change was how password authentication was done. So previously, before Rodauth 1.0, the password authentication was done completely by a database function. So you passed the database function your password, and it told you whether or not it matched. That had certain issues with it, such as database logging showing passwords. So for that reason, we changed it in Rodauth 1.0 so that the actual password hash computation is handled in the app, but it doesn't have access to the password hash. That's why there's now two database functions, one that extracts the salt and then one that checks the password hash. So that was probably the largest change in 1.0. I think in 2.0, the only really large change that we had that was, we had some things that were breaking. Most of them aren't hard to adjust to. So there were definitely wasn't anything close to 180-degree switch.
Okay, thank you. And the second most popular question, how do you sustain your personal interest in maintaining such a big amount of repository over the time?
Mostly, I have to use these repositories. All the libraries I work on actively are stuff I use in production at work and have for a long time. I think that's really the only way to sustain a personal interest is you have to be invested in it and you're basically using it all the time. I have had libraries that I've worked on for a while where I switched to something else and no longer maintain. So it's not like I maintain everything I work on forever. But most of the stuff I work on, usually I get involved with something where I build something because I'm going to be planning and using it for a long time. So I've been using SQL since 2008 in production. Both Rodauth and Roda I've been using in production before the initial release. They were actually, basically I was building them around the needs of my own applications. So I'd be building even before it was released on Ruby gems, I would be using it and testing it internally first to make sure to handle all my needs. But yeah, I think that's the only way to maintain a long personal interest is to be heavily involved with it and have a personal need for it, either business need or personal need. In my case, I have both. All of my work projects and all of my personal projects are structured fairly similarly. They all use SQL, Roda, Rodauth for authentication, that sort of thing.
Okay, thank you for answering to all that question. Unfortunately, we are out of time for questions, so thank you again.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's a big honor for us to have you here as a speaker. So again, round of applause for Jeremy.
Thank you.